Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce, and today I'm going to do my first live stream, I think, on the US elections, which is quite exciting. I'm very excited about this, I have to say, because I'm speaking to someone whose channel I came across relatively recently, but I've come a little bit addicted to. It's fantastic because it gets into the long weeds of polling and election data and things like crosstabs and all these wonderful terms that we're going to be talking about. And as most of you know in the audience, I spend my time obsessed with the war in Ukraine, and the election in the US in November will have a huge effect on that. And so I'm also, as I have been for a very long time, obsessed with US politics. And so this is that perfect sort of confluence of these two things. Now, I have as a guest on today, Dave Trotter from Voting Trend YouTube channel that I think everybody should go and, like, before you do anything, well, no, watch this first, but please go and check out his channel, Voting Trend. It is really good. It looks into in fine detail at polls and data. And please go and subscribe to him. He's absolutely brilliant. And anyway, he is here to speak to us about polling and data. So without further ado, first of all, thank you, Dave, for coming on. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And
Appreciate it.
can you let people know sort of what your background is, what your biases might be, who you are, what your interest and knowledge and expertise is in this subject?
Okay, so I actually started working back in politics in 1991 when I was 17 years old. So I have a history of this and have been working on the Democratic side ever since 2019. I'll get into that in a second. But the first ever campaign that I worked on was Tom Harkin. He was a Democratic candidate running for president, senator from Iowa, and I was working on his Florida campaign. Unfortunately, he dropped out by the time the Florida primary came along. Bill Clinton, of course, won the primary then. And then from that point on, just worked on all different types of campaigns. Some of them I'm proud of, some of them I liked, but not proud of the candidate, such as working for John Edwards twice. And it is that's where my history is from then. And then 2019, I left politics because of the business of politics. As you mentioned, I'm very data driven. And very democratic as well. So I am a Democrat. I don't shy away from that when I talk about my numbers. But I believe you have to have objectivity when looking at these numbers, because that's the only way that you're going to get to the real understanding. If you're a Democrat and you want to know how to win, you need to look at the numbers objectively instead of subjectively to make the right decisions, to then make the right choices.
Yeah, and numbers don't lie. So the closer you align yourself with the data, obviously there's a level of interpretation, but the closer you align yourself with the data, the better, the more objective you're going to be, and the more useful that is for you and for whoever you're working for going forward. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and just in the reason I left in 2018 was that I would have more and more clients, and I don't know if this is maybe the advent of social media and kind of the influx of people into politics. Because remember, back in 1991, if you want to be involved with politics, you actually had to get in a car, go to a meeting, go and do things. You had to actually be active. It wasn't a keyboard warrior activity, right? And now you're starting to see that more and more, which means a lot more people who are involved in politics simply can be influential in Democratic politics by being on the keyboard, saying something.
Well, goodness me! So we just saw the white dudes for Kamala Harris and black women for Kamala Harris and all that. Like literally, like how many tens of thousands of people? Was it a million people on these Zoom meetings, or however many it was? And you're like, wow, that's activism in the virtual world.
Right, and that, I mean, that's positive, and that doesn't not mean anything. Because a lot of people talk about how crowd sizes don't mean anything or things like this. That doesn't not mean anything. Now, it's not the be all end all of, oh, okay, a lot of people are on a Zoom call or going to Kamala Harris rally, so therefore she's going to win. But I mean, look at Hillary Clinton's crowd sizes compared to Trump's. I know Trump likes to talk about those. They do give us a gauge of maybe enthusiasm in certain places. But yeah, I mean, I left politics in 2019 because clients simply wanted me to give them the numbers that they wanted to hear. and not the numbers that I wanted to give them that was correct. And the nice thing about doing this YouTube channel now, because I haven't gone back into politics yet, I'd maybe like to back into consulting, which I did before, is it allows me to give the numbers, though I am Democratic, in a way that is unbiased. So the nice thing about this channel and it growing is I can finally do the political work that I've been wanting to do for the last 30 plus years. So,
Do you know what? I'm with you on that, because YouTube, I've got primary progressive multiple sclerosis, and so I was unable to continue doing my job as a teacher, and so I had to do. I was also writing at the time, and it meant that I had to go back to drawing board. What can I do from home? Writing. I was doing some general work for a statistics organization, but then I was like, no, YouTube came along, the war in Ukraine, and then there's something about YouTube that just allows you, as long as people are prepared to listen to you bang on about stuff that you love, it's amazing. And if you can provide a service to people and a personable kind of interaction, then yeah, YouTube or any such platform, it can be quite incredible. So look, so where you were going with that, we'll get onto this idea of paying you for results that they want. So that's something that fascinates me. Just before we go into who creates polls and why, you often talk about the difference between polls, and you're sometimes quite derisive about polls, even though that's what most of your videos are about. But you talk about polls and then actually just being more of a data man, and you much prefer having the raw data of voting. Can you just talk a little bit to that?
Right. So, as a matter of fact, as we're talking, I am making the script of why you shouldn't trust polls. But like you say, I talk about them a lot on my channel. And I talk about them more as not saying things will go this way or go this way, but maybe to be a little bit more skeptical of them, or look at the data, look at the sources, because there are so many things that we have to look at when it comes to polls. We have to look at methodology. We need to see if the methodology works. And even if the methodology looks good, we don't know if the survey that they're doing is quite accurate. So, for example, if I am doing a worldwide survey of saying, okay, do you support St. Patrick's Day? Okay, if that poll is mostly done in Ireland, that's probably going to be more positive than if it's done maybe in some other part of the world, right? So, I mean, you have to make sure that the biases are addressed, and with data or with surveys becoming much more difficult, that you just, I mean, 40 years ago you could just pick up a landline and not know who it is. You get somebody on the other end doing a survey, you just go ahead and do it. Nowadays, I mean, from the 80s on, we started having caller ID, now cell phones and all this stuff. It's become a challenge, and what's happened is a lot of the polls now we have are called opt-in polls. So the whole thing about polling or survey research is that it should be random. So if you are trying to, so let's say you're trying to do a poll of the UK elections, okay? Everyone who's going to possibly be participating in an election should have an equal opportunity to be called in that poll. But let's say all of a sudden you do an opt-in poll, which means you look at, let's say, an online poll that you see an advertisement, and then you click on it. I mean, if you run the ad on, on let's say Daily Mail, you're going to get different results than if you run it on the Guardian, right? So this is with a recent Atlas poll. They do it like this, the Atlas Intel poll. We don't really know where they did these, what we call web panels. So when it does come to the
so
polls,
this is just to let people know you did it, because it's really interesting. I was looking at 538 and also on Twitter some different pollsters or aggregators who are suddenly there are all these. The trends were very much Harris doing really quite well, all things considered, and then suddenly Atlas, Intel dropped, and a few others have actually dropped that were like suddenly Trump, and you then brought out video worst poll ever, and then I was like, right, okay, I'm interested, because if something bucks a trend in a fairly considerable way, there might well be something going on here. Right. And as you mentioned, these selection biases are possibly at play.
Right. I mean, it's not even just selection biases. It can just be, I mean, we don't know. See, that's where the problem gets when we start having different types of methodology. All of a sudden, we're not sure how accurate that is. So I'm looking at a poll right now that came, and we really need to start talking about Texas in the Senate race and possibly the presidential race. A poll came out from Public Policy Polling, which was a really good poll back in the day, but they now have started doing less and less public polls, which I think we'll talk about. And in this poll that they just released, they show it, I think, a 1-point gap with the U.S. Senate race there. And if you look at their methodology, they have a lot of trust in the past, and their methodology is through some mixed methods, but mostly landlines and cell phones, which again is better because if somebody's asking a question, then they go ahead. If they're talking to a live interviewer, if there's some clarity, they don't necessarily clarify the question, but they just might repeat the question, which you might not get in other things. So you have to take every poll with a grain of salt, but I understand a lot of people just don't have the years of looking in the crosstabs like I do and say, okay, 46% of Black voters going for Donald Trump in Pennsylvania is in a state where that's 11% of the vote is gonna skew the poll towards Donald Trump and put him in the red in their electoral map, which again, what worries me, and this is a big worry, is that it seems like some of these pollsters, like the Atlas one, they did a video about their poll. They don't even understand the fundamentals of margin of error, which makes me kind of worry. Why are aggregators even putting them into that? And that's a whole nother story.
So before we get onto that, because actually there's an issue with a famous pollster called Rasmussen, which we'll look at as a way into who does polling and why. So the other part that was you like data, so as in raw data about that is not so much predictive, but actually is reality itself. Right. What do you? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, okay, yeah. So when we look at votes, so right now I'm working on my early vote model. So I did an early vote model for Florida that has been accurate since 2016. It's the most accurate model of the state of Florida. Now, people might say, why do you just do the state of Florida? It has to do with the availability of data, right? Some states just don't have the data available. Some other states do. Florida is really good at giving us information of how many votes have been cast, either early vote, vote by mail, or on election day. And what I do, and this is something that people need to know, there's a difference between a forecast and a nowcast. So a forecast is looking at something far in the past to then determine a future result, whereas a nowcast just keeps up with numbers, and that's what the aggregates do. They're technically nowcasts, they're not forecasts. So with the raw data, what I like about the raw data are two things. One, they are real votes. So as I see the votes coming into Florida, I just put those votes into my model, right? And then just look at the trends and my knowledge from the previous trends. And I don't actually get a good prediction until polls close on election day. And then at that point, I say, based on what I see, this is what it's going to be. But they are actual votes. The second thing is they can be testable, right? So we can run regression analysis against certain numbers to make some inference as to how the poll should be done, or how the model should be done in my case. So for example, I contend that if somebody, and it's based off of just some sort of methodological framework, just some idea, some hypothesis, and then testing it out, and then making that part of your model. So for example, if I say my idea in Florida, and in the state of Florida, people vote or register by party. I say, okay, if somebody's a registered Democrat, they're going to more likely vote Democrat, Republican, and so on. And then the independent votes, we'd have to see how they split. So if the two regression models are almost exactly the same for Democrats and Republicans, we can basically say, okay, independent voters will probably split along those party lines of who turns out to vote. So it's testable, it's real data, whereas there's just so many problems with aggregates and just polling in general, I think.
Oh, well, I was going to, let's jump the gun though, like just on your early voting data from Florida, any just quick, dirty conclusions you got?
It is really, so I did it yesterday. It is really too early. I mean, we're talking about 0.04% of the vote in as of right now. You're looking at a turnout rate at about, I would say 78%. 8% of the vote. So we're a far way away. And the problem with Florida and North Carolina right now is you just had a hurricane go through there. So that actually delayed some days when it came to votes coming in. However, with that being said, in the state of Florida, and I did a video about this, the Florida legislature and Ron DeSantis tried to basically suppress the Democratic vote. So the Democratic vote used to be really big, vote by mail. So Democrats have been, a lot of people think about it with the pandemic, but Democrats have been really working on this since 2012, I would say. And the Florida legislature changed law to basically make it a little bit harder to get a vote by mail ballot. But looking at the requests coming from Florida, it's seeming like that's actually hurting the Republicans. It's hurting the overall number, but if we look at the percentages, it looks like it might actually hurt the Republicans more than the Democrats. So they might have shot themselves in the foot. So if that's something, we might actually have good numbers for Democrats.
Is that an enthusiasm thing?
I don't know, because it could be a knowledge thing. So what happened is, in the past, what you could do is you could request an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot to be sent to you. And as long as you were active in an election every other year, so either a midterm or a presidential election, you voted, you would continue to get a ballot. Yeah. Now what they've done is they've changed the law that says you have to ask for a ballot every single year. So a lot of people aren't watching what's happening in the Florida legislature. So a lot of people don't even know that this law exists.
Right. And so they would just expect it and it doesn't turn up and then now I can't vote.
Right. And then all of a sudden, if they wait at the last minute, then all of a sudden they might not be able to vote because on election day they might be working or something. Yeah. Right? They might be out of the country, they might be out of the state. Yeah. There could be a whole slew of reasons, right?
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So where I wanted to start was, well, that's a good preamble to polls. Who conducts them? Why do they do it? How do they make money out of it? And how might that skew where the polls go? And I say that in the context of a famous, what is usually interpreted as a right-wing pollster, Rasmussen, often comes out. There are a few, the Rasmussen, Trafalgar, I think it's another one. There will be left-wing pollsters as well. But these guys have got into trouble. They had already been taken off, I believe, before this by 538, the aggregator, for not having good enough methodology. But the Rasmussen are used as soon as they give out a pro-Trump poll, people, the right-wing media go nuts over it. So can you either explain kind of what happened here as a way into explaining how polls get put together?
I mean, at the end of the day, you have, the main question that you have to ask yourself is how do these companies make money off their polls?
Yeah.
Right. If you go to their website, and this is becoming kind of I would even say a pandemic when it comes to 538. We see some polls in there, such as SoCal Strategies, Qantas Insight, that we can't even find who the people are that work there, right? As a matter of fact,
I remember you did that on one of your previous. It wasn't Atlas Intel, but I think you had that same problem with Atlas Intel. But there's another one you're looking at, which is who are these? Where's this poll? Who? I know nothing. I think it might be in SoCal actually. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Actually, I confronted them on Twitter. I have a fake Twitter account. I don't actually put myself on Twitter because I only go there to see if a new poll comes up, because unfortunately they have to do it through Twitter. And I just asked them some questions and then they blocked me. I just asked them, do you have any proof of who you are and what you do? And just even what state you're from. Are you a registered business anywhere? Then they block you. I mean, that's probably a pretty good indicator, and I'll be doing a video about them soon. And this goes to the point, which is if they're not a polling firm that the only thing they have is a Substack page and a Twitter account. So you have to ask yourself, how are they making money as a so-called business if they're trying to be a polling firm? If you, as a client, have no opportunity to maybe contact them, right? And this is what you have to ask yourselves. And when it comes to media polls, a few things. One, media polls are very, very cheap. The polls that are done internally in campaigns are significantly more expensive, go way more into
Really?
detail. Yeah, have bigger sample sizes. Like honestly, the polls that we see from the media are usually that you wouldn't see campaigns actually looking at those, and a lot of it also has to do with methodology, right?
So
So a
that
lot more.
is that to say that campaign polls, because I always intuitively thought that campaign polls would be more biased because campaigns want to, you know, make themselves feel better, but then of course that's not
Mhm.
useful for them. So you could argue actually the other way would be the case.
Right.
But you're saying that actually some of the campaign polls have a better sort of methodology and process because they need to make sure they're doing the right thing, because they're basing their campaign on it.
Right, exactly. And if a campaign ever releases a poll, they are mainly doing that because you might see internal campaign poll in the media.
Right.
They're doing it for fundraising or trying to shift the narrative or something
Yeah.
like that. So they might actually do that. And of course, it would have to be a good poll for them to release it. But yeah, overall, if you look at how much, I mean, I've worked on campaigns where we've spent $50,000, $60,000 on one poll, right? Whereas with these polls that you see that are on pretty decent, networks, they might spend 5 to 10. Okay, because again, methodology isn't as good, sample size might be smaller, so on and so forth. The quality of the underlying data might not be exactly where it is, but at least these are ones that maybe we can look at clients. Now, I mentioned public policy polling, and this is actually a really good case. So when they came on the scene, really in 2010, 2012, you would see them do a lot more media polls, kind of to get their name out there. Now you see them do very few because they are a legitimate firm that has real clients that they can sustain their business off of their real clients. So these polling firms that you see perpetually online and doing these public polls, you have to ask who their clients are. This is the reason why if you look at the polls, a lot of these are done by universities and colleges, right? Because there's no profit motive for a lot of them
Right.
to do the polls. This is why you see so many. But if you constantly see one company like Rasmussen or Trafalgar always in there, and Trafalgar, by the way, has something. I was doing some research called some sampling bias thing. So or socially desirable bias. So they actually skew their polls to indicate less socially desirable responses. But again, that's very subjective. Once you add subjectivity to a poll, it's no longer a poll.
But why would they? So why would they do that? That
Mhm.
in order to produce something that is not reliable, and you know it's not reliable, and it skews one way or the other, you are obviously doing it therefore for money. I would assume, like there,
Yeah.
yeah,
You don't know where the money is coming from,
yeah.
but
But
that,
then,
yeah.
even then, why would an organization want to get inaccurate data just to make themselves feel better without knowing it?
Well, then you have to ask who that organization is. So if you look at a lot of those, like if you go look at the SoCal and the Qantas Insight and all those types of polls, you look at who they are or who they do the polls for, and it's like some you know YouTube page or some right wing blog or something like that. I mean, we're going to be doing a poll on our website for the upcoming Florida 13th congressional district. We're going to be looking at that because that could be a big one. We just funded that poll, but we're working with a pollster who I am familiar with, that I have worked with in the past, who has done stuff and is legitimate. But again, these are like phantom polling firms working for organizations that are very right wing leaning. And again, you're just seeing more and more of these questionable firms out there.
Yeah, and all the sorts of selection biases that we've been talking about. So, for example, if you're landlines, how many young people have landlines? If you're mobile, how many old people have mobile phones? If you're this, if you're that, there are going to be. So you want a kind of multimodal poll, I guess, but then you
Mhm.
would want maybe a weighting of those. Then you get like lost in the weeds of like methodology or
Right.
whatever. I'm going to just play that. Hopefully, you can hear this.
Mhm.
I'm just going to play this as a way into the present election polling, as so we can talk about whether you think they are going to skew one way or the other. So let me know if you can hear this.
Why is it so inactive? I mean, this most sophisticated and well-financed of political systems. Why? One of the problems is it has trouble getting to the poorer Trump white working class vote. Is that still an issue?
I think it still is potentially an issue, but I think there's a wider point to make about the issue with US polling, which is to do with levels of social trust. So I remember looking at this in around 2020, and the polling error by state was quite correlated to the number of white working class voters by state. So, for example, in 2020, the polls had Florida with a 1.8 lead for Biden. It ended up being a 3.3 lead for Trump. It had Iowa as a 2.3 lead for Trump. It ended up being 8 points. So it did correlate quite sharply to the demographics. But the wider thing that was missing was basically voters who have low levels of social trust. So they're just not likely to take polls. They don't trust polls. They don't trust institutions with their own data. And this produces an asymmetrical bias in how US pollsters sample, because the people that they're likely to be missing out on do disproportionately lean Republican. Has that all been fixed? Well, the case for it being fixed is that the US polls perform quite well, particularly at the midterms and particularly in these in-between kind of elections between federal elections. The case against, though, is that we can continue to see it in 2020, quite large errors. We haven't really seen that much systemic change in who pollsters are speaking to in terms of methodologies. So it stands to reason there could well be another error in the offing.
So that was, I thought, a fairly good introduction into this, and it's interesting that obviously it's not people being white that makes them less likely to answer a poll, but it's that trust, it's that social trust. And we actually know from data that trust in government organizations, or trust in general in certain organizations, is more of an issue for people voting on the Republican side. So therefore you could have that bias. So what are your thoughts just generally about the polls at the moment? Are you expecting a continued bias? And I know the 2022 midterms produce a bias that went the other way, but that could be a midterm thing as opposed to a presidential thing. So
right, I mean, possibly. I mean, like if I show you my phone right now, and okay, there's my bias right there, but if I show you the numbers that I have on my phone right now that have called to me, I'm going to have a bunch of spam numbers on there, and guarantee you, because I am not on a place that is a swing state, Illinois, I am not getting a poll. I think with that, one of the problems with the response rates that we have is that people just don't trust any number that they don't know. Okay, so I don't think it is a polling problem per se. I think that it is just I don't know the phone number. I'm not.
Yeah, my partner never answers a phone number if she doesn't know it.
Like, right, exactly. And I think that's kind of where we are. And this is with everything, right? So as far as correlations and other things, I mean, yes, you have the correlation, but you're only looking at 50 data points because you only have 50 states, right? Which still is significant, can be statistically significant and probably is. But I would have to say that overall, when we look at who you can reach out to, most demographics have their issues. So for many, many years, reaching out to Hispanic voters was a problem, mostly because of language. That's kind of been mitigated now. What the gentleman said about poor white voters, you could also say about poor black voters, right? So and this is something that, if we're looking at polls, I think has been a big problem over the years, is that a lot of people say that the Republicans are going to win more and more of the black vote, and then it just never happens. And we're seeing that in the polls right now. But at the end of the day, when the exit polls come out on election day, we're going to see that it's pretty much everything that we've seen for the last, essentially 50, 60 years, right? And this becomes, I think, a problem. So I don't know if it's necessarily that contention that they had. I don't know if it's necessarily true, because I just think it's overall systemic trust problem with just getting unknown numbers in the first place, and that's it.
But will that naturally? I mean, does that lack of trust skew Republican? In other words, I guess, like simply put, are you expecting a similar skew that undercounts maybe shy Trump voters or selection bias in a way that Trump is being undercounted in the polls.
Well, and see, this is where I find it interesting, because the numbers he was talking about kind of seemed like it went the other way, because Iowa is a way more white state, and it sounded like he said that there was a closer.
No, he said it ended up being 2.8 in the polls to Trump,
Right.
and it ended up being 8 to Trump. So
Oh,
it went,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And again, it doesn't necessarily, because again, those are two possibly outliers.
Yeah.
I would have to see what the other states are in there, because all of a sudden you go ahead and throw, some states, they don't even do polling, and you're not going to find a poll from Wyoming at the presidential level. Right.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe there is one, I don't know. But probably not. I think it's a far reach. And I think it's let me back up from that. I don't know if it's a far reach as much as it is an unknown, because there's a lot of pontification as to why this is happening, and people talking about the underperformance of Trump in these polls. Well, if we look at 2012, Mitt Romney was supposed to do a lot better than Barack Obama Mitt Romney was supposed to do a lot better than we expected, and Mitt Romney did a lot worse. So these skews can go either way. We've seen it in the past. So, and again, we're talking 2012. If you go look at the Real Clear Politics average of 2012 and then see what the actual result was, you could see, I think it was Obama was going to win by like 2.5, but then it ended up being in the 5 or 6 range or something like that. So,
do you think, because in the rest of that interview, he goes on to say that, look, it's all about the battleground states, but if you're looking at a general election poll, and if Kamala Harris is winning 2.4 to 4%, then she's probably in a bit of trouble, or it could go either way. It's just too hard to call. But over 4% of the general, if she's getting like 5%, the general election polls, then I would be confident to say she's got a good chance of winning.
I do. I mean, I look at it this way: anytime any candidate's over 50%, that's going to be fine. Obviously, it's the Electoral College, and I'll be mentioning this in another video. I got a line of them I'm ready to do, which is that 2008 or 2016, not in Pennsylvania, but definitely in Michigan and Wisconsin, were a turnout problem. They weren't a polling problem. So
this is what it's going to come on to. Yeah.
Right. And if you look at the numbers, and as a matter of fact, I was literally working on that this morning, so I might actually have the numbers up right now, and I actually do. If you look at the change in vote from for let's say 2004 John Kerry to Hillary Clinton in the state of Michigan, Hillary Clinton basically lost 200,000 votes. Okay. So, and then what happened is 2020 came, those voters came back, then a little bit more because of COVID, right? So what you do is you see kind of this Democratic number, and you see a little dip in 16, and then it kind of go back. Now, the one state that looks really good for Democrats is North Carolina. So over the last, between 2004 and 2020, the Republican vote, like the raw vote share, has gone up 41% for Republicans, but has gone up 76% for Democrats.
Wow.
So, right. So we're talking about something quite significant. And it's these kind of trends and these type of things you have to look at, because a lot of people, whereas in Wisconsin, or excuse me, Pennsylvania, for example, we've seen the Democrats only increase 18% and the Republicans actually increasing 21%. This is why I've been sitting there saying, and a lot of people are saying it's kind of crazy, and maybe it is, that I think North Carolina is way more possibly of a competitive Democratic state than maybe Georgia or Pennsylvania.
Well, to talk about Pennsylvania, I mean, this is where you get to talk about crosstabs, which are basically where you analyze the metadata and how it breaks down, and you look across these different like columns of voters and data. But you've said that Lehigh and Northeast in Pennsylvania, basically, is it correct to say whoever wins this one district of Pennsylvania, like Lehigh Northeast, will win the election?
I mean, even if the margins come down, because there are some places where we've seen the Democrats just collapse in Pennsylvania. So you have this northeast area, and then you have the west. Okay, so if you look at a lot of the counties in and around Pittsburgh, so Allegheny County is where Pittsburgh is, it's becoming more Democratic, while the counties around it are becoming more Republican. Okay, but the region itself hasn't necessarily changed. It's just the shifting of where those votes are actually coming from. So the percentages have been close. In the Northeast, where you have Scranton and other places, Wilkes-Barre and all that, you have, or Wilkes-Barre is in North Carolina. You have an actual changing of the votes. And this is where a lot of the problems are. Now, Joe Biden did a little bit better there, just because, you know, he's the boy from
Scranton Joe.
Right, exactly. So can Kamala Harris do well there? This is where I think Tim Walz plays more of a role. A lot of people are talking about Josh Shapiro. Again, a lot of people don't realize that in 2020, when Josh Shapiro was running for Attorney General, Joe Biden actually did better in Montgomery County than Josh Shapiro did, which was Josh Shapiro's home county. So I don't think he would have brought anything to the ticket. There's nothing empirically there that shows that he would have actually done anything more than what would happen. But yeah, the Northeast is big.
Yeah, one, it's just that it like, if you get that, then you're going to get Pennsylvania, and if you get Pennsylvania, then you get, arguably, you're going to win the whole thing. So, you know, you can see these sort of dominoes potentially.
Right. Well, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, you're talking about Scranton, and I just had this as part of my Ukraine war news. And by the way, do you want to show people your Zelensky doll? Because a lot of my people are
this thing kind of gets into every video that I have, so I make sure.
That's awesome. I love a bit of Zelensky doll there.
Right.
So I was talking about how Scranton has the army ammunition plant there. You've got these a number of different manufacturing facilities that are doing well out on the back of, say, the war in Ukraine, but that's kind of irrelevant. I'm more interested in union workers, and CNN had a report that actually looking at some of the data on union workers, that the Democrats are actually doing very poorly. And you've seen this over time as they've shifted. It's very similar in the UK. In the UK, you've had the working class Labour supporters move, and Brexit came along and they moved across to sort of anti-Europe. So some of them moved to a Euroscepticism that is more populist. And so they were transforming into the Reform Party. And the Labour Party's morphed from being like a unionised working class party to being something more of a middle class intellectual sort of party, or mix of both. Right. And to a degree, the Democrats could be accused of being that, from their roots of the union movement to more of your kind of liberal urbanized voter, and they've left behind some of that kind of Rust Belt, these legacy cities. That actually means that they could be in trouble in some places, like, for example, Pennsylvania, and then there might be strikes going on in ports. I mean, this could be an absolute terrible thing. Longshoremen, I'm really quite worried about that. For I think this could be the October surprise for the Democrats. Could be some wide scale strikes going on that could bring the whole supply chain to a halt. But anyway, you know, are union voters, working class white voters, a bit of a worry for the Democrats?
Well, there are a few things. So the numbers have become even. So this was a demographic where the Democrats would do quite well. And then when people say, are you part of a union household? In the past, a lot of people would say labor unions, but now we have public service unions. We have, we have police who are very Republican. We have firefighters. We have Ask Me, which is basically public employees, and all those. So we do have differences in those workers and the shifting of that. But, you know, I say, for me, I say it just comes down to maybe like what happened in Britain, you know, going from old labor to new labor, right? Yeah. This was kind of the beginning of the shift. Now, it happened in 1992 with Bill Clinton and the New Democrats, Democratic Leadership Council. It eventually happened in 97 with Tony Blair, winning the landslide. You have this shift from being the party of Neil Kinnock to being the party of Tony Blair, and you in the Democratic circles too. You had it going from the party of Michael Dukakis to being the party of Bill Clinton, right?
Yeah.
So I think what has happened, and if you really want to look at some data, geographical data, look at DuPage County, Illinois. I mean, I'm from the Chicagoland area. It's one of those counties that back in the 1980s, 1970s, and so on, was considered like one of the bedrocks of middle class, upper middle class conservatism. Now it is a strong Democratic county. Okay. So you see this absolute change. So what's happening is this is why I don't know if it's necessarily detrimental. As the economy goes down, it will be, because there'll be less and less middle class voters, right? But one of the problems you're basically having a shift in the electorate. So the Democrats have decided to go for more affluent people in the suburbs by not working on working class voters. And this really started back in the 1980s with Macomb County and the Reagan Democrats in that 1980 election. So, and those have basically stayed to the Democratic side. Another thing, and this is maybe getting more into the political science aspect of it, and I think I actually have a book by him right here, Seymour Lipset. So I don't know if you've ever, this is about differences in Canadian and American politics. But one of the things that he has always argued is that in the United States, unlike other countries that kind of have, and the UK is a perfect example, have political parties based on kind of like the three pillars of political thought. So you have a conservative movement and a Tory traditional conservative hierarchy movement. You have a liberal movement with the Lib Dems. And then previously, I guess it can be argued now, you would kind of have a socialist workers movement, right? Whereas in the United States, we never had that socialist workers awakening. So therefore, the Democrats and Republicans have always, for the most part, been based on where they fall within traditional liberalism. And that is the driving force. So this is one of the reasons why you see a lot of people who are poor might vote against what we hear is against their economic interests, because they're also voting on the issue of gun abortion.
Yeah, so I think I've written many an article on this in different places, but you know that single issue voters in America is a very particular thing. Well, I think it's particularly strong in America, where you would vote on the Second Amendment rights, or you'd vote on abortion, or these particular things, and you'd forgive everything else that happens. So, you know, yep, you can screw my taxes over. Yep, you can do this. I don't care if you're going to screw me over in all these different ways, as long as you're fine on guns. And you know, you hear people just say that explicitly, literally say, as long as you're cool on guns, you're fine with me. And you know that, and that just skewed. So actually, it goes to another question I was going to ask you, which is how much, because you talked about this quite a number of times, which is the ideology doesn't. I mean, if we're not going to talk about the dyed in the wool voters on each side, we're going to talk about the swing voters, the independents, the undecided. Ideology isn't that important. I think is something you've been saying. It's actually more on, or is it vibes, ideology, policy? Right. What drives these people to move from one to the other?
Right. So, and I always mention this. So I'm a member of APSA, the American Political Science Association. And even though I'm not in academia anymore, I was working on a PhD, but I quit after a few weeks too, because I just didn't want it. I was mostly doing it to try to get Canadian citizenship, to be honest. But anyway, with that, in political science, amongst behaviorists and people who study this, one of the jokes is that voters vote on issues, right? So and this goes to the point that voters really aren't issue driven. There's a book called The American Voter that was made in the late 50s, early 60s, and it examined voting behavior and basically said your partisanship. And this is, and before I get into that, this is one, being from the UK, I think this is really interesting that in America, we have political party identification as part of our identity.
Yeah.
Right. So people don't say, maybe in Tory circles, maybe somebody says, I am Tory or something, but people in Britain more will say, I vote Labour, I vote Tory, I vote Lib Dem, whereas in America, we say, I am a Democrat, I am a Republican, I am a Democrat.
That's a fascinating like that language difference. It does a lot of heavy lifting. You're absolutely right. So in the UK, you're much more likely to say, I vote Tory because my parents did, and there is an inheritance that goes on there, which will be the same in the US. But actually that's changing, and people are much more free with their votes now. We aren't as aligned as we used to be. It was not so cemented in. Whereas in the US, you're right, it is an absolute identity thing, and therefore I think that forgives an awful lot of ills. So because I've talked about this a lot on my channel, that when you are talking about someone like Donald Trump, that they are so wedded to your identity, because your identity is a Republican, he represents republicanism, so therefore he eventually comes to represent you. So any criticism on Trump is therefore by extension a criticism on you, and there's a lot of psychology involved in voting, and you're not going to disabuse someone of their voting habits or their voting inclinations by rational means. This is a psychological thing where that is my identity, and therefore you can much more easily allow this person to do all sorts of crazy things because actually he's an extension of me, and you have cognitive dissonance, etc., etc. But anyway, that's a digression from what you're saying. But yeah.
No, but actually it's really to the point too, because I think this is a fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans, because Republicans are more along those lines. The Republican Party has done an excellent job of making republicanism a culture. And one can really ask themselves, is there, before just Republicans were conservatives. Now one can make the argument that republicanism and conservatism are almost two different political ideologies, right? Whereas the Democratic Party, we're not focused on Democrats are maybe a little bit more focused on issues. So I think in Democratic circles, if something comes up as an issue or if there's something going on, it is inherent amongst liberals to not necessarily question it, but to look at the data, make sure everything's right, make sure, okay, this looks okay. And that's what I do with my polls. When I look at polls, I say, does this look good or not? I don't automatically say, oh, this is bad because it's Republican and this is why. I do that. But with the Republicans nowadays, they automatically say, I'm on this side. And one really good, I'll have to find the article that was written, but a political scientist the article would have had to have been about 10 years ago. So speaking of Ukraine, look at wars in relationship to partisanship. Okay. So wars usually should be considered a nonpartisan issue. Like it's not a left or right. If there's a war, there's a war. If there's not, there's not, right? But the support for that war will be based on if the country interacts and then who the president is. So if you go and you look back at
Iraq,
if you look at Iraq, right, you see that. If you look at Kosovo, you see all of a sudden Democrats were much more for it than Republicans,
right?
Okay, and so
in Ukraine,
in Ukraine, right, you see Republican. Though most Republicans are still somewhat for it a little bit.
The data is actually different to what the people up there, the Matt Gateses and whoever.
Right. Yeah. So it's like you take this thing that should not have a left-right ideology to it, but based on who the president is and what the action is, then that determines who supports the war or military action or not. So you take the attacks that Trump did, those small little attacks on Syria, where he sent a missile or two into Syria that one time, and Republicans were for it, Democrats were against it. So it's just, this shows how much of we are stuck on this identity of partisanship, that even something should be nonpartisan like a war becomes a partisan issue. I mean, even Iraq, like you said, look at the people, look at the debates during the Iraq war in the Senate. Those are really interesting.
And it's absolutely fascinating. I think I've often thought Democrats are a bit like herding cats. And and this might have a lot to do with liberal versus conservative psychology. So if you look at the political psychology of, say, Jonathan Haidt, and the idea that you've got 5 or 6 different ways of evaluating people, and what they see as important or not can define whether they're liberal or conservative. So fairness and lack of harm is something that liberals will have higher than conservatives, who will have authority, purity, tradition. All these kind of values are much more, and literally conservative. That's what to conserve those traditions. So, but what I've found recently is that there's been this fracturing on the right with MAGA republicanism against that conservatism, which kind of it goes to what you're talking about with how the Ukraine war is seeing, where you get this fracturing of populism that is kind of going against Ukraine, and then the old school conservative Republicans being, still for Ukraine, and there's just a very interesting schism, because when you only have a two-party narrow democratic system, there's very little representation for the wide range of human beliefs, and it's incredible that you still only got two parties in the US.
Well, and there's a reason
Really?
why, because we really get into the only reason we have that is we're stuck into, okay, let me just put my own personal spin on this. This is the first election in my entire life, in a general election, that I'm actually voting for a candidate. Okay, so every other time it's been to make sure that the Republican doesn't win. Right. So I've always voted against a candidate. And this is what it is the reason we have a two-party system is not necessarily because we're happy to have our person. We're afraid the other person is going to win. Now, I have a family member who will get online and is absolutely Republican, and he'll get on Facebook, do his thing that he does on Facebook, and he'll never talk about what the Republicans can do. He always talks about how the Democrats are a threat.
Yeah.
And this is why we keep the two-party system, because it's more about having people more in fear, because all of a sudden, if you have a little bit of, let's say a Jill Stein somehow got some votes, which, her sitting next to Putin, I have no respect for her whatsoever. But, and I mean, that's another thing when you talk about, you have to talk about interference in elections. I mean, that is a true thing. But if you, let's say, have a Green Party that's like a legitimate Green Party, then the Democrats are going to say, if you vote Green, then that means that you're going to get Trump as president, so you can't vote Green, and so on and so forth. There was a time where we said we don't care, and that was 1992, 1996, where you did have a lot of people vote for Ross Perot, and people were just tired of the system. A lot of people contend that if Ross Perot wasn't in the race, that George Bush would win. No,
you'll never get a reform to the system, because, and it's the same in the UK, where actually we're first past the post as well, whereby first past the post is always going to result in whatever party that gets in getting in, and so therefore that party is never going to go, so let's now reform the system that just got us elected. So it's just this self-perpetuating issue that's
and this is why I think is because the one political outside of the United States and Canada, the other one I follow closely is Australia. I think Australia has it perfect. I mean, you have that first round, and then you have that preference vote. And I think that gives you the ability to vote for who you want in that first round, and then show your preferences in the other one to actually get the majority. I think like instant runoff voting and stuff like that is great. We're seeing that in Alaska now.
Alaska. Sorry. Yes.
Right.
And Maine, actually, Maine as well.
Yeah. Right. So we are starting to see that. And it is a problem. The first past the post is a problem. I don't think as much here sometimes, because we don't have like these three-way splits.
Yeah, because it's only
or maybe five-way splits.
Yeah, you're right.
Right. I mean, let's go. If you look at,
then it stops. The problem is that it stops those third parties. You don't have the problem of first past the post because there's no third parties that are realistic. But that's because you've got that. So it's like, again.
Yeah, and if you get like a place like, let's like Northern Ireland, if you take like South Belfast, you can have DUP, UUP, SDLP. Possibly Sinn Féin, and then like Alliance. You now have like a 5 or 6 party split, and then someone like a Naomi Campbell can come in and win with 30% of the vote, and it's like
you have just exhibited more knowledge of Northern Irish politics than any English person I've ever spoken to.
Really?
Yeah. That's Northern Ireland. I don't understand that. They don't even have Labour and Conservative up there. So yeah.
Right. Exactly. And then Scotland's a whole nother, and Wales as well with Plaid Cymru. Right. So yeah.
Check you out. What was I going to say? We talked about Lehigh. We talked. So policy and vibes. So your conclusion to that was what is going to drive those middle voters more then?
Vibes of hope and change.
Yeah.
I mean, really, that and look.
Or vibes of not wanting, vibes of fear though as well, like you're saying. So one of those two vibes.
Right. So vibes of fear. I think it's more vibes of hope. I guess it depends on the election. right? Because right now you have, and we have the vice presidential debate tonight. The one advantage, big advantage that the Democrats have are both of their candidates, presidential and vice presidential, Harris and Walz, are above water in their favorability rating. So that means people trust them. Everyone and everybody asked about 2016. Look at Hillary Clinton's disapproval rating. That's 13, the reason, right? Exactly. This is the reason why she lost. And a lot of people just, and the turnout thing. You know, a lot of people just thought, oh, how could Trump win? So therefore I'm not turning out.
So there's a lot of enthusiasm. So I do a lot of watching rallies and comparing them, and Trump's rallies recently have been really like low key, small, B, his vibes are terrible. He's gone real low energy. They've also become really divisive, almost fascistic. And although there is an argument to say fear is more powerful than joy, sadly enough, it drives you physiologically more. And there's some, you know, we could talk about evolutionary psychology and whatever, but he is the enthusiasm that he's generating is not nearly enough compared to the enthusiasm of these massive rallies that Harris and Walz are doing that are just, they are going off. But the question is, do they transfer to votes? Like, are we going to see that?
I mean, if you look at 2008, I mean, okay, now I'll just admit something right here. In 2008, I had a big problem with Obama. He's my U.S. senator, right here in Illinois. The reason I didn't like him, I mean, I worked for John Edwards in that campaign, but the reason I didn't like him because the only thing he did as my U.S. senator was run for president, right? So he didn't have any track record. He didn't really campaign on any real issues. It was just hope and change, hope and change, hope and change. That obviously led to one of the pretty good victory for Barack Obama. Same thing with Bill Clinton back in 1992. I believe in a little place called hope, stuff like this, vibes and feelings. Even go back to John F. Kennedy. The person looks good on television, sounds right, and all that, vibes. So it even comes to that. I don't know if you have it there, but I guess in Britain it's a little bit different because you aren't electing the head of government. You're electing the member of parliament who then elects the head of government. Is that we have this, who do you want to have a beer with analogy, right? Who do you want to sit down and have a beer with? And 2016 was probably the first election that you didn't want to sit down with either one of those two, right? In Joe Biden, you did a little bit more. So unfortunately, and this is back to that American Voter book, they basically say our political ideology, or I should say our partisan ideology or partisan identification is based off of family history and all that. And then V.O. Key actually wrote, I have a book about Southern politics up here. He wrote that book and he died before the book was published, called The Responsible Voter, or The Responsible Electorate, which he basically said voters aren't fools, that they look at issues. Basically, these whole models of spatial voting and where people fall on a spectrum, they find that those really aren't an accurate assessment of where people are, especially in places that are multi-party as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like the JD Vance. Why would people come and have a beer with you? Who's asked at that rally? It's like, because I like beer. And you're like, great answer, mate. Great answer.
He just has no idea. And this is so funny because for years I have said one of the biggest problem with Democrats, they don't know how people work. Yeah. And like JD Vance fundamentally doesn't know how people work in general. And I think in Walz today and in tonight's debate, because we have the debate coming up, is I don't think he should attack JD Vance. He should just let JD Vance do what he does. Put trust in Tim Walz and make him seem like the father that's going to be out there and protect the country. If he starts attacking JD Vance, I think he kind of loses that narrative. Make him the trusting dad to win. If that happens, I think game, set, match, honestly.
There seems to be a lot hanging on that, and it's such a shame that to a degree. But yeah, so the question is, in enthusiasm terms, who is more likely to engender a response from their electorate of not being bothered to get out and vote, to not, I'm not going to go and queue up for a load of hours today. Are we justified in believing that that enthusiasm we see at the rallies for Harris and Walz is going to transfer to the enthusiasm to get out and vote? Does it go beyond those rallies? Are there people out there, or is this just a big crowd of in-group people?
Right. I think that it will change because 2016 scared the hell out of people. Okay. And that's why, I mean, because everyone thought that Trump wasn't going to win, people were complacent, they didn't vote, and Trump won. Okay. And remember, he still lost the popular vote, and we could have another situation like this. So I think that, and I saw the same, what I'm seeing happen right now is the same dynamic that I saw in 1992. After 3 consecutive Republican administrations, we just automatically thought that the Republicans were going to win. It was like we couldn't believe that the Democrat Bill Clinton was going to win until we actually saw the networks project that he had the most electoral votes. I feel that we're kind of in that vibe, in that feeling. And I do think Democratic voters are now scared. Now that Trump has been president, and there have been some changes, and now the Supreme Court changes since then, it's
I
a
don't know.
worry
People
about
seem to have amnesia, though. People seem to have, like, you know, it's reminding me, like, when you go back and listen to something. I mean, he says crazy stuff. He's saying even crazier stuff now. But when you look at, you know, what happened and what didn't happen, like the only thing that he really achieved was a tax cut for the rich. And I don't know. I think there's this rose-tinted glasses view of his presidency that is allowing him to be in a position that I don't think he's properly entitled to. But there you go.
And that's the media's fault. That is the media's fault. Trump washing and both sidesism, as we call it here. There are some, like MSNBC, though partisan, they call it out, but you know, CNN feels that they have to play both sides when there truly is something wrong. I mean, if a man is convicted of 34 felonies, that is wrong, right? There, he's doing something not within the realm of legality. Right?
Like, it's like, honestly, if you just looked objectively at this and said, right, here's a guy that's been convicted by or found liable by a jury of his peers for sexual assault. And then here he is a few months later up on stage saying, I'm going to be the protector of women. I'm going to protect you. You'd be like, how did that happen? And yet, again, that's a reality that the American voters are living in. It's insane.
Because for them, for his voters, it's better to have anyone than have a Democrat. I mean, it is like
that's it.
Yeah.
That's exactly. And so there's a lot of thought that this is all becoming political noise. That the kind of all the crazy stuff he says, that it's like people are like, yeah, it is a bit crazy, and yeah, okay, but actually, I'm cool with that. It's not.
If I don't know if you hear it, but there's a tornado siren going. No, it's okay. They do a tornado siren test every now and then, so you might hear it through the microphone.
I thought that someone
living in the Midwest, right?
Someone hoovering in the background.
Right. Yeah. So it's the life of living in the Midwest. You have to deal with tornadoes every now and then. Yeah. So but it's clear as a bell out there, so nothing's happening. So don't worry.
So I don't want to keep you too long, but a couple of questions on Florida and Texas, because man, these are fascinating. And there's long been this thought that Florida's a bit different, but Texas is been turning purple, but it just hasn't quite happened. Like Beto O'Rourke did really well. Ted Cruz is also deeply unpopular, but also as a state, it's going slightly more purple. But there's a very strong chance that Ted Cruz is, as a senator, even if Texas doesn't vote for Harris, that Ted Cruz could be voted out, which could be this outside chance of the Democrats holding on to the Senate, because just for those international viewers at the moment, it's pretty much a 50-50. They've got Joe Manchin has just resigned basically, and he was in a state that is particularly Republican, and he was this kind of middle of the road. He was a Republican in all but name, really. So the Democrats are going to lose that certainly, and maybe John Tester up in Montana as well. So in order for the Democrats to hold on to the Senate, they need to pick up some really surprising wins, and it could be that Ted Cruz is one of them. What's your thought?
Right. Well, I do think that going to Manchin really quick, I think that's a pretty interesting thing, because you can say, talking about the change in the electorate, you can say that Democrats have basically gone from swapping the state of Virginia for West Virginia, right? So that kind of can
Right.
show you how the electorate has been. As far as Texas and Florida are kind of different. And with Texas, what happens is you are seeing it become more Democratic. With Florida, you're seeing it become more Republican. So the way the trends are going are in opposite directions. This is why I'm very iffy about Florida. I still don't think Florida can be won. I want to look at more of those numbers. Good thing is I look at because I have this 30 plus years of knowledge, particularly in Florida, I know what to look for. But like in Texas, a few things. One, another poll came out today that shows essentially nearly a tied race. If you remember, Beto O'Rourke ran against Ted Cruz in 2018, and the polls underestimated Beto O'Rourke's chances, and it was a lot closer of a race. These polls are now significantly closer than those ones with Beto O'Rourke. So I have now, and as we finish, I'll be making the video about Texas because I think we really need to talk about Texas. I don't see enough in Florida. And this is more.
So Rick Scott against what's her name? What's her name?
Parsical Powell or something, or Marsical Powell. Yeah, I even forget her name, and I lived in the state for decades. Yeah.
So so she's. I think last time I looked, she was like 3 points behind or something. So maybe just a little bit out of reach for her, but certainly a lot closer than we have seen it in Florida. But Florida used to be, of course, a battleground state, and it doesn't seem to be that way anymore. But they are getting a little bit excited in the villages. So I don't know.
Right. Well, you'll always see those videos every election. You'll see that group of people in the villages doing that. And I lived in Orlando, so I wasn't that far away from that. That's just outside of Ocala. But so
just to let people know who aren't in the States, so this is like a retirement area where people are predominantly very, very Republican, and they go around on their golf carts with flags for usually Republicans. But this year there have been golf carts going around with tooting their horns and flags for Harris. So it's been quite interesting. Smaller amount, but.
Yeah, well, one of the issues, and this is why I just don't think it's happening, in the last election in 2020, Democrats had a voter registration advantage, whereas now Republicans have over a 1 million voter registration advantage in the
Why has
state.
that been happening? Because that's not just there. A number of registrations seem to be skewing towards Republicans.
This is actually interesting and to look at now in the state of Florida, I think there are just demographic changes. This is the reason why Ron DeSantis won overwhelmingly in the last election for governor. But if you take a state like, let's say, Arizona, okay, a state where you register by party, because not all states you register by party. It all depends on the primary system as well. So if you have an open primary system, or what we call a semi-closed primary system, whereas if you're an independent voter, you can go in and vote in either the Democratic or Republican primary. But if you are a Republican voter, you can only vote in the Republican primary. It actually is more, it gives you more of an incentive to actually be an independent, so that if, let's say, you live in a place where you might be a Democrat, but the only primaries are Republicans, you can vote in a Republican primary. So there becomes these incentives to actually register in a state like Arizona. In a state like Florida, I think we just see these changes. Same thing with Pennsylvania. I truly believe Pennsylvania is just starting to become more Republican, and I think the pathway to victory for Democrats is more North Carolina than Pennsylvania.
Yeah, there's not that much of it. There's only a difference of 3 in the electoral college, isn't there? Votes there. So, but
yeah, I think it's 16 and 19. Right.
Right. Yeah. So you think that Colin Allred might have a chance might have an outside chance, but we're more likely to have a greater Harris success in North Carolina.
In North Carolina, I mean, the pathway to victory, I think, is Pennsylvania, Michigan. And again, as we mentioned, 2016, those were turnout problems. And then all you need now, I do believe that they're going to pick up Nevada and the 2nd congressional district in Nebraska. So that one electoral vote, there's been really, really good polling, which might be indicative of what might be happening in the Midwest overall. We'll see what happens.
Let's bring out the map just so people know what we're talking about. So these ones in grey are battleground states that are a toss-up, right? So that's why they're in grey. You've got Nebraska's 2nd district, that it sits inside Nebraska as a place that gets the electoral college vote that goes along with the popular vote in that district, a bit like Maine has some as that as well.
Right.
They tried to challenge that, and luckily, I think very importantly, that was not it didn't succeed. So
Right.
you've got these grey ones, and if we're looking at Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, if they can all stay Democrat, then that's pretty much a victory for Kamala Harris. But North Carolina could be an interesting one. Georgia might be a little bit out of reach. And you're saying Nevada's likely to go Democrat, but Arizona possibly not. Is that
right? And yeah, I mean, I look at first of all, I wouldn't say Minnesota is by any stretch of the imagination a toss-up. So that one is definitely.
Yeah, I'm surprised that's there, to be honest.
Right.
And in fact, and Nebraska too, to be fair as well.
Right, because there have been 2 polls out of there that show a significantly, and that's also a congressional race. Remember, when it comes to the House of Representatives, Democrats only need to pick up 7 seats, and there have been some major changes in New York, which means they're going to grab one. There's been a congressional district in Alabama that's now been redrawn to be Democratic, and there are a lot of competitive ones in California and that second. But yeah, Nevada, the thing about Nevada is, when I worked for John Edwards in 2008, the one thing you notice about Nevada is just the Democratic machine. Right, the Democratic machine. So back in the day, Harry Reid, no longer with us, but Harry Reid had an amazing Democratic machine, the most impressive machine to get out voters, do things I've ever seen in my life. Now you have the Culinary Workers Union also having that big a machine, and they're the ones who really can control the employees who work in the casinos and stuff like that. And this machine, every time I've seen it work, it hasn't failed. It can look close. I mean, Harry Reid was supposed to lose to Sharon Angle in 2010, and he ended up winning because of that machine. I think Nevada goes Democratic, and then if Wisconsin, Michigan, and Nevada go Democratic, then Democrats just have to win one of those 3 states, whereas Republicans kind of have to run the table to some extent.
So you think it's now starting to look more difficult for the pathway? There are more options for the Democrats to win than there are for the Republicans, which is a complete switcheroo to what it was, say, 2 months ago, completely.
Right. Change candidates. It's amazing what it does.
Yeah, amazing. Personally, I'm thinking Alaska's going blue, so that's what I'm putting my money on. But there you go.
That could be the. So in 2008, the Democrats won Indiana, and that was like the big shock of the night, and that's because of Gary, Indiana, and the areas around Chicago. Alaska could be the Indiana of 2024.
So here's the interesting thing about Indiana. Sorry, not Indiana. Alaska. Alaska has Lisa Murkowski as a senator who has just come out and not endorsed Trump as a Republican senator. That is interesting, and there are some saying that she might go independent, which would be fascinating. And she's like big on women's rights, I would have thought. And so she won her seat because she lost she lost the primary, didn't she? She won it in write-in votes.
Yep. She lost it to, I think his name was Jeff Miller, and then she ran as an independent and a write-in independent and won. Right.
Yeah. So this Alaska's interesting, and stuff's happening there, and it's a bit like Texas, really. And I think the getting was it Pascola? No, what's her name? The congressional representative there.
I'm trying.
Mary Pascola or something like that.
Pelota, right? I forget. I forget how to pronounce it. Yeah.
But anyway, she's from the indigenous population there, and ran as a Democrat, and with a ranked choice voting, she got in, and that bucked the trend. So I think you're seeing an interesting trend in Alaska.
Right.
Look, sorry. Yeah. Carry on.
No. I was just saying, in Alaska, there's just 2 areas of concentration for the Democrats. If they perform well in Anchorage and do well in South Anchorage, and then just get the margins a little bit better in East Fairbanks, the state will be there. Places like Juneau and other places are pretty liberal. Yeah.
So I've thought, I don't understand why. They've got a massive war chest, right? The Democrats this year, and I was just watching a CNN report on it earlier today, where he's comparing. No, it wasn't CNN. It was Ratner was doing the old looking at how much money the Democrats had raised. I was thinking, dude, if I was the Democrats, I'd be slipping a couple of million up to Anchorage and going, what have you got to lose? There's three electoral college votes you get from Alaska, just just go hard on Alaska, and the Republicans wouldn't be ready for that.
And what's weird is, like, looking at media markets, North Carolina is more expensive.
Yeah.
Georgia is, I mean, most of the media market in Georgia is in Atlanta, but Nevada is a very cheap media market. Like I think Las Vegas is like 27th in the nation, whereas you got Phoenix, which is like 11th or something.
Right.
And so they could pump a lot of money. And obviously the Reno, Carson City media market is cheap as well. The problem with North Carolina is
sure Alaska media market is going to be fairly cheap.
Oh, it's going to be absolutely cheap. I mean, it's going to be spread out, but they're going to all be cheap. And you don't need to spend money in Juneau. You just spend money in Fairbanks. That's the only thing. And it might actually cover, I don't know the Alaska media markets as well, but you know, there might be a separate one for Fairbanks, because Fairbanks is where the capital actually is. So, yeah.
So before I go into my super thanks, and thank you, I haven't been keeping an eye on the live chat, so thanks guys for a really lively live chat, no doubt. I guess where we'll finish, two things I wanted to finish up. These are such big bloody subjects anyway. So we'll go first of all, Latinos. Speak to me about Latinos and the problem that Democrats might be having there. Is it a worry?
It's a worry, but it's a worry, but I don't think it's a crisis. I think it's a little, I think one of the problems that Democrats have, and they've had this problem forever, is that they put certain people in certain demographics into certain silos and then say they only think about this issue. So, female voters, we have to talk about abortion because that's all they're going to talk about. And Hispanic voters, we have to talk about immigration because you have 5th, 6th, 7th generation Hispanic voters. You have Hispanic voters that have been here longer than my mom's side of the family when they immigrated here back in the early 1900s, right? And late 1800s. So again, this goes to the point of, and this is where I think Harris and Walz have done a good job. They haven't gone into this silo approach. They're talking about opportunities for everyone.
Unity. The whole thing is about like bloody everyone, and particularly Republicans. Let's whack 7 Republican speakers in the DNC. And
Right. And I think that is going to have an impact. Is, voters in all segments, voters don't want to be pandered to. Voters want to be treated equally. And I think in this situation, it'll be interesting to see what the numbers are, but I do see a little bit more of a correction than we've seen in the past with Hispanic voters. So it's either stagnant or a little bit more. And again, it depends on what state. If you're looking at a state like Florida, it's a little bit different than, let's say, a state like Arizona, because you have Cuban Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Mexican Americans, Colombian Americans, and it really shifts. And each Cuban Americans are significantly more Republican than Mexican Americans, right?
Yeah, and but also to counter that, as the Democrats lose Latino voters, as in they still have a really big difference between Republicans, but that difference has shrunk in successive elections. But they've also gained in college-educated whites, for example, as far as I understand it. So there is we'll take from this, we'll lose from this pot, but we'll dip into that pot, and so it's not all bad if you understand it in the wider context. Possibly. Okay, final questions are, what can we learn, if anything, from the midterms and from special elections, particularly because they have, so just to let people know, special elections when they are elections outside of the usual cycle, where maybe someone's died, maybe someone's been indicted for something or whatever. So you have a random election, and those elections have really undercounted, or people's predictions for the Democratic success have been much lower than reality, and Democrats have done really, really well in virtually every single special election in the last however many years. And can we draw anything from that? And likewise from the midterms that went particularly well, or a lot better for the Democrats again than we're predicting in 2022, can we draw anything from that?
For special elections, no, because I think for the most part those are really diehard voters. So in a lot of times you'll see a special election go one way, but then when you get right back into the regular election cycle, it just flips back to what it was before, right? There could be some outliers like George Santos's congressional seat when he resigned from Congress because of all the crazy stuff he did. But now, like, that district has been redrawn, I believe, in New York to be more Democratic. So New York is a whole different thing. But I don't think we can see much in the special election. As far as the midterm elections, I think that's a real question due to the fact that if you look at some of these swing states, you can see that their turnout rates, while not at presidential levels, were significantly higher than what we had seen in previous midterm elections. So when we see those higher turnouts, we're talking about electorates that could possibly mirror each other, right? And so I think there could be something. But then again, when we talk about midterm elections, we're talking about a whole different set of issues. And one of the biggest problems with midterm elections for the Republicans last time around, they based their whole entire midterm election strategy on Joe Biden having a low approval rating. Well, Joe Biden's not on the ballot, so that's not going to matter at all. I don't look too much into midterms to necessarily be that. There are times where there have been midterms and special elections that have happened. As a matter of fact, in Pennsylvania in 1991, Harris Wofford was ran for U.S. Senate and special election won. That kind of was a precursor to possibly how the Democrats would do in 1992. So it could happen. It's just a flip of a coin.
I don't know if it's you that was talking about this, but it's worth noting that going back to Texas, Colin Allred against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is deeply unpopular, but he's Republican. Texas is, but in the last election, so senators have 6-year election cycles, and that means that senators are often not elected during a presidential election. So, so Ted Cruz's last election was in 2018, which was not a presidential election, and he came. Beto O'Rourke came within 2.32. I don't know, whatever.
Yeah, it's like 2 point something. Yeah.
And this time, I don't know which way it could go, but there's an argument that can be made. I don't know if it's you that made it. That it's like actually in a presidential election, Colin Allred could pick up more votes because it being a presidential election and not a midterm, and or it could go the other way. So I don't know. Either way, Colin Allred.
Well, this is where the Hispanic vote's really important, because usually where you see the biggest discrepancy in turnouts from midterms to presidential election years will be amongst Hispanic voters. So they're less likely to turn out in a midterm election. Now, this is mostly in Florida from my experience there. I don't know if that really holds as true in Texas, but if it does, then that does bode well for all.
Yeah, when you're getting 60%, of that or whatever it is. Right. So just going to go to some super chats. By the way, Dave, you're welcome. I don't know if you care to do this and whether you never want to see this video ever again, but you're welcome to mirror this video on your channel if you want to put it up for your audience as well.
Yeah, I have this little playlist of channels I've been on before, so yeah, I'll throw that on that playlist.
Yeah, so but feel free to download it and do that. Joe Hales, thank you very much for your kindness here, Joe. Can't believe even how Trump can even be taken seriously. Surely they have to make more of all his lies. Need to advertise the truth to debunk him. It's a funny thing that though, Joe, because he's been lying ostensibly for 8 years and
since he came down that escalator.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah, the PolitiFact or the Washington Post with their 34,000 lies or whatever in his 4-year tenure. So it's noise, and it's almost what was fascinating. So actually, Joe, here's an answer to that. Something like I've got it lined up for my next video, but something like 78% of Republican voters rate him as either fairly or completely honest at the moment, right? So if you've got an electorate that sees one of the biggest liars in politics in the last generation ever, like literally ever, like one of the greatest liars. So yesterday he said Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, has not phoned the president to get help for the president has not contacted Brian Kemp to give him help for disaster relief for this Hurricane Helene. And he said that. Meanwhile, Brian Kemp's on camera saying, I've just been on the phone to President Biden and he's given me everything I want. Everything I've asked for, I'm getting. So you've got this situation where he is outright he's just lying ridiculously. Like it's honestly like it's daytime and he's saying it's night. It's that kind of thing. And for 78% of his, or whatever the percentage is, of his core like electorate thinking he's either fairly or completely honest, then it doesn't matter. There's almost nothing we can do. We almost need to forget about Trump. Hopefully he doesn't get voted in, and then go, right, what do we do about people lying in public to the electorate? How can we, like, even with some kind of regulation, I don't know, but something needs to be done so that this cannot happen, because you are getting people voted in on outright lies, and that is dangerous. Sorry, rant. Thanks, Joe. Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate 5 ATP Geopolitics memberships. Thank you, mate. You are such a strong supporter of the channel. Thank you to Johnny Nedgarad, Nedregard even, for your membership there. And Simon Keep, Slava Ukraini, indeed, Heroim Slava. Thank you very much, Simon, for your super sticker. That's very, very kind of you. Goose Springsteen, thanks for a great live stream, guys. Thank you, Goose, for your support, mate. And another one from Goose. More on the current average, is it correct to say Trump has more of a chance of winning versus 2016 and 2020? Or do you think the smaller Harris lead is more reliable due to better polling?
I mean, in my opinion, I mentioned this in my video yesterday. I had a professor at University of Utah. His name was Dan Jones, and he was one of the pioneers of polling in the state of Utah. And he always said, those who live by the polls die by the polls. And that's unfortunately what we see with these aggregates and everything. So many people are so focused on what the polls say. I mean, back when I was working in politics, started in 1991, 1992, a poll would come up and go, oh, cool, a poll. Now let's go. Now it's like people, and I'll admit, a lot of my channel is based on, taking apart these polls. Everyone's looking at them like a hawk and thinking that's the reality of something, right? Again, this goes back to what I said in 2012. They underestimated what Barack Obama would do, right? So, and I think The Hill actually had a good article out about this as well today, as a matter of fact, talking about these polling biases and that they just shift, they just change, they just happen. And remember, another thing that there were political scientists that actually researched this about aggregates being accurate. We don't have enough data points to determine whether these are really accurate or not, because we've only started these since 2008. So we have 8, 12, 16, 20. Yeah, we don't even have 24 yet, right? So as far as presidential years, we only have 4 data points.
A small sort of sample size, yeah.
Right, and they predicted, like, in order for them to get a good representative sample as to these polling aggregates being truly correct or not, that they would have to do polling for like a few hundred years to end up coming up with this idea. So that these aggregates are correct. So that's why I just don't put anything into aggregates at all.
So do you personally, though, do you think that Trump's got a worse chance of winning than against Clinton and Biden?
Yeah, because 2016, both of them had horrible approval ratings. So that's what killed Hillary Clinton. 2020, technically, Trump had the power of incumbency. Usually that helps. Didn't help him there. And he does not have that power this time. I mean, things are looking better now. But again, the vote by mail numbers and these numbers are coming in we're at the infancy of really getting an idea of where this is going.
I do get worried when I just look at Twitter and I just get bombarded with Elon Musk amplified like rhetoric that is so like makes me almost vomit. And then I start worrying because I think, God, the whole world is thinking like Donald Trump Jr. and David Sachs and Cat Turd and Elon Musk and all these like horrible people. And then I get depressed. And then I look at the Alabama American football game the other day where Trump turned up and the whole crowd is going mental for him. And then I get depressed. And then I look at the Harris rallies and then I get really happy. And then I'm up and down like a yo-yo.
Yeah, that's
yeah. And John Larkin, finally, thank you, John. And I knew you would do something like this, John. JP, explain what a cockwomble is and see if Dave would describe Trump as such. I can guarantee that he would. I think I speak for him there. But anyway, that's a bit of a urban slang in the UK.
Right. I was going to say, I do not know that word. So I mean, I could guess what it would be. Probably not in a positive way, but the particular meaning I would not know. Yeah.
Susan Melendi, thank you very much. Sorry, there's 2 more. Trump's whole career was built on lies and people believed he's a con artist. Well, I think it's true. Like So it's not just about interpretation, it's about data. One of the best data points is looking at what he would do. There's a great Forbes article that looks at what Trump, how much money he'd have if he had just invested it in the S&P 500, right? And he would have more money than he had now. So he is a person who has inherited an awful lot of money and has gone bankrupt 6 times, been taken to court a load of times. Trump Stakes, Trump University, a $25 million lawsuit, Trump vodka, Trump this, Trump that. Just he is not even a very good businessman. He is a bit of a con artist. So I'll just leave it at that. But thank you very much, Suzanne. Von Rees, remember the stolen Ukrainian children? Yeah, Dems up and down the line. Absolutely, and that's something I need to talk about more on my channel, but on my other videos. But thank you, Von Rees.
And I've never and now I might say something that's a little bit odd here. So as I mentioned, I left politics in 2019 to become an English teacher. In 2019, I also moved to Murmansk, Russia, where I actually taught English for 6 months, and I still teach English today because I do like doing it. And an overwhelming majority of my students are Russian, who are no longer in Russia. They all went to Yerevan and they all left, and they said, we don't want to go to Russia. So it's unfortunate that a lot of these stories now in the media. So I follow Ukraine and I follow what happens in Russia very closely because it's like I taught, and of course, a lot of my students are from Ukraine as well, actually in Ukraine right now, living in Kyiv, living in Lviv and other places. So I know what it's like. And, yeah, stories like the children and all that, it's just like we hear about them a little bit. And then what is that now? When did that start? Like a year and a half ago, almost, when this all happened. And it's just like we don't hear
2.5 years now,
yeah. We just right. We just don't hear about it here in the United States. It's kind of like if it's not in a cycle, it gets swept under the rug, and then I have to go to certain Telegram channels or YouTube channels to get an idea of what's happening on the ground. Because like even the incursion into Kursk, it was hardly even covered here, even though that's a pretty damn big story, right?
Yeah. My goodness, you're getting me excited talking about Ukraine. Finally, Daryl Carson, thank you very much for your super sticker. Really appreciate. He's got his mugger hat on, which is "Make Ukraine Get Great Again," which I like that. Which is what good old Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to make. She made that cap to make it really bad, but actually people took it on and it's like, yeah, that's awesome. Let's make Ukraine great again. So I love it. Well done, mate. Look. Dave, I really appreciate the time you spent with me. I could speak to you personally for like an entire day.
Right.
Dude, it's a long time still, but a very short time. I mean, we have snap elections. We spend 50 million quid on an election in the UK. And we just do it in a month. You guys are spending billions on an election, literally. And you stretch it out for months and months. 5 weeks left, something like that. Would you be up for doing another sort of live stream like this at some point to talk about how the polls have changed and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think after tonight, well, I mean, vice presidential debates usually don't matter, but they could. I mean, so yeah, absolutely, definitely.
Brilliant stuff. We'll look, stay on the line for a second. Thank you very much for the audience. Please, first of all, Dave, where can people find you?
Just pretty much on there on Voting Trend on my YouTube channel. I also do have a Substack, which is also votingtrend.substack.com. So if you want to go ahead and join there, feel free to do so as well.
That's brilliant, and you can find all that detail there, and I think that might be linked below in the description. If it's not, I'll try and get that done. So please go and whack up his subscribers because he produces such great content. Look, thank you, Dave. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the viewers. You take care, guys, and I'll no doubt speak to you pretty damned soon. Thank you. Toodle pips.